We certainly want to welcome all of you online tonight who are joining with us, or those of you who are taking this by demand at your own convenience. It's good to be able to come together as a family of faith, and to all of you here in person, what a special time for us to get to come together. We enjoy Wednesday Night Alive. We enjoy it because we love teaching and we love having to learn. We always learn far more than you will learn because we're digging in and trying to make sure we understand, and we love teasing and laughing with one another. So please, I hope you'll always enjoy it and take some of that with, no, we're just having a good time and we enjoy teasing, and hope you can enjoy it too. Why don't we bow for a word of prayer? Oh God, we're grateful for tonight. What a privilege to be able to come together without fear of persecution, to be able to come together and know that we can be a family of faith and be able to think freely, to not all agree, but to still to love one another. You are the one who's called us together to be your church. It is your grace that gives us hope and peace. And so what a privilege to be able to come together tonight. We thank you for all those who work so hard to prepare such a lovely meal. We thank you for those who gave so generously so we could all eat for free. Oh God, we are indeed blessed. And thank you. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to come and to grow ever closer to you. Bless us now. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, as we start tonight, we wanted to do two things. One, our feedback a lot from last week. We listen to your feedback in the many ways that we receive it. And it seemed like one of the things last week that struck a chord, and we thought we'd kind of just present it in a little different way to be understood. And it was two things. One was a timeline of the Methodist Church. And secondly was the structure of the Methodist Church. We're going to present both and just a little different than how we did it last week.
So let's look at the timeline first, and this is, you should have this on one side of your handout. And so you have the long line that goes across the timeline. Above that line is kind of our spiritual ancestry as part of Methodism. And so you see that the Methodist Episcopal Church was formed and formally formed in 1784. You remember we talked about that at the Christmas conference at Lovely Lane Chapel. Then in 1844, the tensions had been building, and so finally in 1844, the Methodist Episcopal Church split into the South Church and the North Church. Then, of course...
Just a real quick parenthesis on that one. First Methodist downtown Oklahoma City. What were they? They were the Methodist Episcopal Church.
Of the North. They kept they didn't change their name, even though it really split into two different.
And we were a Methodist Episcopal Church South.
Even though we're north of them.
And we met together for 1 week, and we decided that was enough. First Sunday after the land run, just the Methodists came together for worship. And so after that, we split on the second Sunday after the land run, and that's when First Methodist came into being. We are the oldest. We will trace our roots back to the first Sunday, but don't tell them that because it'll get you into a fight. So, but we know we're correct because we have the flag from the first week.
We met at 3rd and Broadway, and that's where we established our church, and that was in 1889. The Methodist Church was formed when you had the two Methodist Episcopal churches coming back together. North and South came back together, formed the Methodist Church, 1939. The United Methodist Church was established in 1968, and so here we're at 22. So if you look a little below that, you see the years, the duration of those events. So we have been part of the United Methodist Church for 54 years. We highlighted that last week. The Methodist Church lasted only 29 years until you had the creation of the United Methodist Church. The Methodist Episcopal Church South lasted 96 years, and then the Methodist Episcopal Church lasted only 60 years before they split. St. Luke's has been a church for 133 years. And so as a church body, we have lasted longer than any of those Methodist traditions. We've been Methodist from day one through day however many days 133 years are, and we'll continue to be Methodist. That's our DNA, it's who we are. Even though you'll see lots of different expressions of ways that you can live out the Methodist faith, we very much are Methodist, and our expression and our DNA is Methodist, and we have been around for 133 years. But remember, so 133 years beats any of the Methodist traditions you see on that timeline, but remember before that, our spiritual ancestry was part of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, for 250 years, and before that, we were part of the Roman Catholic Church for 500 years. But before that, we were part of the universal one church, everybody's happy church that dated all the way back to Christ for 1,000 years. And before that, our spiritual ancestry, because we were adopted into the chosen people, we were part of the Jewish faith going back 2,000-3,000 years. And so this timeline, the years look pretty small when you consider that kind of ancestry. Below the timeline, you see several of the different expressions of Methodism coming from John Wesley's tradition. You would have these different kind of breakouts or groups that would kind of merge in. And so you see churches from 1787, the Free Africa Society, that would give rise to the Africa Methodist Episcopal Church. You start to see brethren churches. Where I grew up in Ohio, there were brethren churches everywhere. And some of the brethren were still very much part of an older tradition. And the Methodist churches I attended were part of the Evangelical United Brethren that merged to form the United Methodist Church. My best friend was part of a brethren church that all of especially the older women, wore these caps that were kind of a net cap. They always wore those wherever they went. And so you have those kind of traditions from the brethren. You can kind of think when the older traditions are very similar to the Amish church. But then you get into more of the experiential churches, the holiness churches, Church of the Nazarene, Church of God, Assembly of God. And so many different expressions of faith came from John Wesley and the work that he did.
You may not have known that we actually were related to the Assembly of God, the Church of God, the Nazarenes. They are cousins of the United Methodist. Or the
Sometimes
Methodist
they'll claim us.
Sometimes they'll claim us, sometimes they won't. That's okay. But that's really where is our heritage, where we come from. So we just thought you might enjoy seeing the many different churches that really have sprung from John Wesley. In fact, when you look at it, it says the World Methodist Council, that was formed, and there are 80 different expressions of Methodism back in 1881. 80 different expressions of Methodism that made up the World Methodist Council. And they still meet every 5 years. I was privileged to get to be a delegate from Oklahoma, representing Oklahoma, to the World Council of Churches when it met in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And you may have heard some of my sermon illustrations about that experience. Truly a highlight for me to be a part of that group and what it was like. And so there are Methodists all around the world, and that's why these 80 different expressions get together once every 5 years. Okay. To jump into the other side, your United Methodist Church structure. We just wanted to come back so you could again see this in a different way. We talked about last week how we were formed at the same time as the United States government, 1776. We're 1784, and so then you wind up having such a comparison. General Conference is our legislative branch, Judicial Council is the Supreme Court, Council of Bishops are kind of the president. They don't have the same power as president. General Conference is the place where you pass laws, and they really speak for the Methodist Church. we listed out here under General Conference, we didn't talk a lot last week about general boards and agencies. And these are all the different agencies, these general boards, that begin to do work of the Methodist Church. I'm going to come back in a second and talk about them, but if you drop down, we got 5 jurisdictional conferences we talked about. Their business is to elect bishops. There are 53 annual conferences in the United States. Those are each led by a bishop. And then we have 8 Oklahoma districts, which are led by a district superintendent who all report to the bishop. And then you have 462 local churches in Oklahoma, one of which is St. Luke's. And so St. Luke's is a part of a district that is a part of the Oklahoma Annual Conference, that is a part of the South Central Jurisdiction, that is a part of the United Methodist Church. As many of you said last week, wow, that's a lot of layers. And it is a lot of layers. And that's one of the things we wanted to talk about was what has kind of happened with the church. And so when you look at the general boards and agencies, so many of these first came into being back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, a part of the merger, and they all provided and did very important things. For instance, first time I was a delegate and went to General Conference, you get assigned to a specific one of these boards and agencies. I was assigned to the General Board of Global Ministries. We're concerned about reaching out around the world. I had a tremendous time learning all about what we were doing and what we had done. The General Board of Global Ministries in the 40s, 50s, 60s was extremely important. How many people did you know back in the 1940s or 50s, if you were alive then, that you knew were going to Africa or they were going to Russia? Ordinary people weren't just doing that. By the year 2000, 2010, lots of people were traveling all around the world. But that wasn't true in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And if we wanted to have a presence in the world and be sharing the gospel of Christ, you needed an agency who could make contacts and then help to send people to these places. When we went to Russia back in 1992, you already had things changing. There was David Stone, who happens to be the uncle of Rinzai Stone, if you know Rinzai, a member of our family of faith. It was his uncle, David Stone, who came up with an idea of how to go have friendship evangelism in Russia. He went to the General Board of Global Ministries, sold the idea, and they said, go with our blessings and you go under our banner. They then invited churches. 2 agreed to go. One was Whitefish Bay up in the northeast, and the other was St. Luke's. And that's how we went to Ulyanovsk, Russia in 1992. So the General Board of Global Ministries blessed it, but the idea was already from David Stone, and then St. Luke's did all the work. We didn't report back to the General Board. We didn't necessarily consult them. We went to go do our thing. And we're still doing our thing 30 years later.
Who paid for it? Who paid for the trip?
St. Luke's paid for the trip. St. Luke's, we raised over $100,000 to send 40 people to Ulyanovsk and then to bring our guests from there to the United States, because they could never have afforded that. So we raised the money, we went and did it. Right before the pandemic, we were looking at starting another international mission in Kisumu, Kenya. And now there's no other governing body that said, why don't you go to Kisumu, Kenya? We made that choice. Our partners with World Neighbors, we're going to talk about them tonight. And so we said, let's go to Kisumu, Kenya. And so we went, we made contacts. We were all geared up to begin this mission in Kenya.
We made one trip.
We made one trip. We visited with all the people. We made our contacts like this is going to be great.
We scheduled the second trip.
And COVID hit. So if you're interested in being part missionary and traveling to Kisumu, Kenya, amazing place, wonderful people. That's going to probably start back up in 2023. But we're the ones who are making the decision where to go, what to do. And so in many ways, things like the General Board of Global Ministries still do some good things, but they aren't as necessary as they were back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the same thing is true about many of our general boards and agencies. The publishing house, everything used to be published. Now it's on the internet. Curriculum, everybody did Methodist curriculum for our children. That's not the case anymore. So many of these things that you see here had an important purpose. They did an important job, but the world has continued to change dramatically in the last 25 years, in the last 15 years, and the rate of change is only increasing. And so part of the challenge for the Methodist Church right now is how do you adapt, how do you evolve and stay current and effective and important what you're doing?
It was several years ago that our former bishop, Bishop Hayes, invited Bishop Robert Schnase to come to St. Luke's. Bishop Schnase is at the time was bishop over Missouri, and now serves in the Rio, Texas Conference, which is actually a merger of the Southwest Texas Conference and the Rio Grande Conference, which was largely Hispanic churches. And so they merged those. It's the Rio, Texas Conference, and that's where he is serving now. But this was several years ago. He came to St. Luke's and gave a presentation on what was needed in the denomination, the changes that were needed. And one of the things he pointed out was that, now, just a little note, because he's talking about how much technology has expanded, how much we've grown, and how much the church has changed, that we needed to be up to date. He gave this presentation in the Christian Life Center and used a flip chart. He was writing on it, and I'm like, okay, some of it still could be up to date, but he's a great author. And anyway, in his presentation, he talked about how the denomination really is the denomination that was created not just in 1968, but back to 1939. And so many, many years ago, if a church wanted to do an international mission, they would have to call kind of their annual conference office, the Office of Missions, and ask them and inquire, what can we do? They would end up calling kind of the general boards, what kind of missions could be done. They would kind of arrange for those settings, get back to the annual conference, who would get back to the church. And so think of all those different connections and phone calls and all the time it would take. I mean, imagine all the different scheduling kind of issues. Now we have Doodle and kind of different polls online. We can get that done quickly, but send it back to the local church. That's how they got to do an international trip. And nowadays, you can click on your computer, go on the internet, and you can contact the mission site yourself, make all your arrangements, and it's a straight shot versus all these different stops along the way that are still set up for mission back in those days. We are a church primed and ready for the year 1950. Is some variant of the quote. It's not that they haven't done great work, they have. But with any large institution, it's hard to make that change, because what are all those stop points representing? People's jobs. And they've got a plan and they've got a structure, and it's hard to kind of downsize from that structure. People don't usually do that willingly. Usually something happens like a pandemic that brings about those kind of changes. But he was talking, and this was a bishop, an active bishop in the United Methodist Church, who was saying, these are the things that have to change for the denomination.
The question is, does the local church exist for the denomination, or the denomination exist for the local church? And you can watch and trace what happens with John Wesley and the growth of structure, where we are, and probably where we need to be changing as we come to this point in history. We're going to come back and talk about that a lot over these next 5 weeks because it is so important. And again, we're trying to lay a foundation so that the things we begin to talk about will make sense. Because when you look at that, you can see all of the structure that is going on, And nowadays, you can go into the local church who can begin making decisions to make things happen immediately, which is a very, very positive thing. So, how did we get to who we are? Quick story that longtime Methodists will know. John Wesley, as a young man, felt the call to ministry, and he went off to Oxford. And when he went to Oxford, he was a very disciplined young man. He'd been raised by Susanna, one of, 19, 20 children?
19 children that I guess we know their names. There were others that didn't
passed
survive.
away early. So Susanna had to run a tight ship to be able to make the house work.
19 kids. You have to...
I go visit my daughter and my son-in-law, Andy, and they have 4.
And it's wonderful.
It's wonderful. However, our oldest grandson did say once about the family, he said, "You know the definition of chaos? It is us." So 19 children. Susanna had to be disciplined to be able to make it all work, and so she did. And so that's what he was raised in. He understood it. And so when he goes off to Oxford, he decides he wants to be growing in his faith. He wants to be a holy man. And so he forms a club with several other students and call themselves the Holy Club. We're going to be together and we're going to be committed. We're all going to agree we'll get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and we'll have Bible study for 1 hour till 5 o'clock. And then at 5 to 6 o'clock we'll do some studies. And 6 to 6:15 we'll have breakfast. And then 6:15 to 8 o'clock we'll go to chapel. And I mean, that's how they did their day, blocking it out like that. And that's what they would do because they felt if they followed that, it would make them better people.
And they wouldn't waste a moment. All of their time would be efficient.
He really was big on not trifling your time away. So the issue of, we look today at our planners and how to be efficient. John Wesley was doing all that 300 years ago. I mean, he was amazing at how he blocked his time. How can I be effective? So the Holy Club was at work at doing this. All these young men there at Oxford. Well, this was also a time when Oxford was kind of more of a party school.
I think that if you were to try to sell the Holy Club at any college, probably at any time, I don't know that it would fly.
I'm sure that it would at the University of Texas, but it probably won't fly at OSU or OU or OCU. No, so he gets the Holy Club going, and they're working really hard at this. Well, the other students were looking at him, and they said, "You people are just weird. I mean, you are just so dang methodical. You have a method for doing everything. You're nothing but a bunch of Methodists." That's where our name comes from. From John Wesley at his time at Oxford, when they are being so methodical and all the things that they're doing, they become called Methodists. They didn't choose the name for themselves. It was a name to poke fun at them that the students chose for the Holy Club. They did grow in their knowledge. They did do extremely well by being so methodical.
Then they embraced the name. I mean, it really was true, and they embraced that. So as an example of how he lived this his entire life, can you show when he was 80 years old? Go to the 81 first. So this is out of his diary, and this came out of a research article, and it showed what his schedule was when he was 80 years old, June of 1783. And so he would rise. The first number is an AM number. The second number is a PM number. And so the number below that is the hours that he was awake and at work. So Sunday the 1st, he got up at 4 a.m., went to bed at 9:30 for 17 and a half hours. One thing that happened, like when I think it was about 83, there was a notation that he would take an afternoon nap, and the research article was stating probably due to his age. And I thought, anybody who has this schedule deserves a nap. It doesn't have anything to do with age. But this is age 80, and then they went back and compared it to age 37. And a couple things you notice. One, actually, there were far more days that he was getting up earlier when he was 80. And so it kind of shifted from earlier and going to bed earlier. But it really was almost the same number of time. I think the average hours he was up each day was a difference of less than 30 minutes. The second thing it shows you, he kept a diary his entire life, every day, recording what he was doing, what time he got up, what he was doing throughout the day, what time he went to bed. So they could do research and pull a month when he was 37 and pull a month when he was 80 years old because he was methodical. So the reason he did this, yes, it's a tad bit compulsive, but it was his way to plan out his day. He really examined what kind of resources did he have in life. And so for him, resources are things like, obviously, money. So you need to use your money wisely. He wasn't afraid of money. He did know that the more money you accumulated and just let it sit around could cause problems. And so when he started asking people to limit their drinking, I don't know if you've ever been to a bar, but cocktails and drinks are expensive. When they stopped drinking, they had more money. And so to prevent them from just having this money and letting other things develop that might not be healthy for their spiritual life, he really helped them help others. And so there was this whole cycle. So not only your money, but another resource is your health. You have to be healthy to continue this type of schedule, to be able to go and preach at all these different places. And so it's important for you to take care of your health so that you can do all these things for others. And so this is how he kept incorporating his life. It's all about what resources can you give here on earth for the sake of sharing them with others. So take care of your money, take care of your health, watch over your reputation, and all these kind of different things that you could use to the glory of God and bring them to a healthy nature. You can see the things that mattered to John Wesley. One of them was the Foundry Chapel in London. Now, Foundry Chapel was originally a place that made armory, kind of guns and weapons in the preceding century for King Charles. And early in the 1700s, they were pouring kind of molten lead, and one of the casings had moisture in it, and it caused this terrible explosion that tragically killed several people. So that huge building sat abandoned for several years. And then John Wesley and Charles, his brother, came and acquired it, and it became kind of the center of Methodism in London until 1778. And they put in roughly the equivalent of 125,000 to 150,000 British pounds in today's dollars to just renovate the place. It would seat 1,500 people in the main sanctuary and another 300 in a meeting room behind the sanctuary. It was basically a community center. On Sunday mornings, it was built for worship. But throughout the week, they had a free medical clinic. They had a kind of a pharmacy on site where they could dispense free medicine. They had a surgeon on site. They provided a free school, especially for the children who were homeless, running the streets and weren't able to afford schools. They provided a school for these children to help educate them and help them in their future. And John Wesley created a lending society that started off with microloans. And so they were starting with these microloans to people to help better their lives and get them further along in society. And then, once they started making money, he challenged them to give back and make a difference in the lives of others. So you hear very much the kind of the things that were important to him: health, finances, kind of the welfare of others. He built at least 2 houses that were for widows and orphans. From the Holy Club days, he was in the habit of visiting the prisons. As bad as you think, and as bad as the prisons are now, the prisons of that day were atrocious. And they were places where you just were left to die. And so for them to start visiting was just this huge kind of change in thought. Why would you ever visit prisoners? They deserve to be there. And to show mercy and compassion on the prisoners and those in the lowest socioeconomic rungs, like we talked about last week, preaching to the miners and in the open field preaching. They credit John Wesley and some of his contemporaries at preventing a revolution in Britain like had happened in other countries. But he cared about health care, education. His very last thing that he wrote, and John Wesley wrote many, many things throughout his life. His last letter was a letter to Wilberforce against slavery. And he called out the fact that American slavery in the U.S. was the worst of the worst. But that was his last thing to write was purposeful. He was all sold out for ministry. And of course, all of this, embedded in this, was winning people to Christ. And so John Wesley sometimes gets critics from people who think he's too socially minded, and they kind of ignore all the things that he talks about: personal piety and winning people to Christ, having a relationship with God. And then you have people who criticize that and that he's not enough out in the community, but they haven't read the whole picture.
I think you can hear by the things that he was passionate about, the education and the health care, and I'm going to be taking care of the poor, the hungry, the microloans. That's very much our DNA, the values that we hold here at St. Luke's and have held here at St. Luke's for 133 years. It's the kinds of things that are important, and we still follow very much in that tradition. I want to make sure that I leave at least 5 minutes for Wendy at the end to be able to talk about how we have lived that for the last 133 years. But just a couple of things that I want us to kind of hear. When you go back and look at this structure that developed over time and began helping to do so many of those values, this structure was so they could live out the values of John Wesley in the 40s and 50s and 60s. What began to happen was the only way you have this is somebody has to pay for it. And how do you pay for it? It's apportionments. We're going to help you learn about apportionments tonight. It's the local church that pays for all of this. And this has grown and grown and grown. And we want to take a moment to be able to talk about that. Does the church exist to serve the denomination, or does the denomination exist to serve the church? I heard a quote just the other day from Bishop Tom Bickerton. Tom is a friend of mine, and I got to say, he is one of the finest Christians that I know, a man of incredible integrity and faith, and he is right now the president of the Council of Bishops. So that's kind of like the bishops all get together and they'll elect their person to head it all up. But he was being interviewed, and he was responding to some push from the WCA telling churches not to pay their apportionments. And his answer was, he responded to it by saying, the first and most important responsibility of a connectional church is to pay their apportionments. I would disagree with that. And if you push Tom and you ask him about his compassion to win new people to Christ and serve in mission, he certainly has that heart. But I do think that statement revealed something that is true about the Methodist Church. From my experience, this coming June, I'll be a Methodist minister for 50 years. Started when I was 19 years old at a little country church. When I was at a little country church in a town of 200, and I had 3 churches, and I preached 4 times on Sunday morning and never saw 100 people. But at that church, I had apportionments, and the question was asked, did you pay your apportionments in full? And wherever I had gone as a young pastor and was starting out, that was the question my district superintendent, you remember who they are, that's the question my district superintendent would always want to know. Are you paying your apportionments in full? If, as a Methodist minister, you paid your apportionments in full, it's weird how there seemed to be a correlation between you getting a promotion or not. There was no question a good Methodist minister will pay their apportionments in full. The one time in my 50-year career that wasn't the most important question asked was when I was in Houston. Finus Crutchfield from Oklahoma was my bishop. And Finus Crutchfield was the bishop in the Texas Annual Conference. And for Finus Crutchfield, the most important thing was, are you growing the church? And so whenever I met Finus Crutchfield, you'd walk up and it wouldn't be, hello, Bob, how are you doing today? He'd walk up and say, hello, Bob, how many members did you take in Sunday? I mean, you knew that was going to be the question you're going to be asked. And it was amazing how the Texas Annual Conference began to grow rapidly, because that became the standard by which you were going to be judged in your effectiveness. And if you were hoping to get a little larger church, you're going to move on. The question will be, are you growing the kingdom? That was his value. It's the only time that I've been asked of that. I've been to General Conference many times now, and I have to tell you, when you go to General Conference, where we're back to our big structure here, we're all going to gather together, we will spend this much to this much time talking about growing the church. We talk about fossil-free UMC. We all shouldn't be burning fossil fuels. We'll talk about boycotting Caterpillar because of what they're supporting the Jewish state against the Palestinians. We'll talk about all kinds of things. We talk a whole lot about human sexuality. But we spend so little time, if all, talking about how do you grow the church.
Is it any surprise that in all that history, the church hasn't grown? If you aren't focusing on what matters, I think you find those results.
Now, have we done some great things during this time because of our structure and our commitment? You better believe we have. And so I want to make sure we lift that up and show you some of the things we've done. Why don't we hit the colleges and universities first? What do we have maybe? We believe in education. John Wesley believed in education. Did you have any idea these institutions were started by the Methodist Church? Boston University, USC, Duke, Emory, Syracuse, SMU. No, that's just a part. There are so many more universities that we have helped to start. We believed in education. Again, I want to say, a number of years ago, we started all of these universities. When was OCU started?
18.
115 years ago. We're not starting universities at this point. It's not the world we're living in. It's not what we're winding up doing, but we did. Healthcare. All of the different Methodist hospitals, significant ones. Methodist Hospital in Houston. Both of my children were born there.
My daughter Hannah was born at Deaconess, which is a free Methodist church hospital here in Oklahoma City. It's famous for adoptions, and Hannah was adopted, so. So, the Methodist Church was committed to health care, and especially for the poor, and so we did so much in helping to start so many institutions. Now, these institutions, just like the universities, they may have a Methodist sitting on their board of trustees for so many of them, but so many of them do not. And so they are not controlled by the Methodist Church by any means, but we were the founders of them. Same thing is true with the hospitals. We do not control these hospitals, but we were a part of the founding influence of all of them, as you can see just even from their names. So a real commitment to that is some of the things that we did. It's not what we are doing today. It's a different world, and we as a church, the church,
really are not in a position to be doing it. But we did, and I think that was so very important and significant. Let me take just a moment to talk about apportionments, and then I'll throw it to you, Wendy. The way that it all gets paid for is from all the local churches. As you can imagine, there's got to be a budget from the general church. There's got to be a budget that supports all of these agencies. There's got to be a budget so you have a jurisdictional conference and an annual conference, and every annual conference is going to choose ministries and things to do. We have a lot of incredible programs that we've done here in Oklahoma, Circle of Care and NSO and Boys Ranch, and it just goes on and on. So, but we made a decision to do that. They all still have to be funded, and then there's even things you do in your district. So all that, it starts here, it gets passed down. The annual conference then puts together its budget, and so you have a budget, and just think about it as a pie. And now we have 462 churches, and we say we're going to have to give all 462 churches a piece of the pie. So what's your fair share? We've used different things in the past. We've used membership. We've used attendance. We use right now money. What is the money you spend to run your local church? And so you get a decimal of the total pie based on how strong you are as a church, how much money you're spending to run your church, and then you get your part of the pie. You're apportioned. It's your part, an apportionment. You get your part of the pie that makes everything from the local district to the conference to the jurisdiction to the general church to the boards and agencies go. Okay? When a denomination is growing, it works pretty well.
All the local churches are growing.
If all the local churches are growing. Right now, that's not happening in the United Methodist Church. Next week, we're going to talk a lot about some numbers, statistics, growth, what's happening. Where is the church growing? We're going to look at Africa next week and some of that there. But right now, and for the last 40, 50 years, the United Methodist Church has been declining. And because we've been declining, and we're a part of society, church in general and society has been declining. It was really big in the 1950s when all the boys came home from the war and got married and had families. People went to church. And as a society, less and less people are focused on that. So as a denomination, we're having that problem as well. But not all churches are declining. St. Luke's, your church, is booming, as are many other churches that I can name. But the majority, significant majority, are declining. So just think about the concept. So if you have the pie, and everybody's going to get a piece of the pie based on how much they spend or how strong they are, well, if Church A used to take this much of the pie, but now it's this much of the pie or this much of the pie, and you're over here and you had this much of the pie, and the person beside you is taking less and less, to make up the whole pie, what has to happen? Yours is getting bigger and bigger and bigger if you happen to be the growing church. In the last 3 years, we can put up the apportionment sheet there. Back in 2019, our apportionment that was being asked was $300. You don't have to go to this one. $347,531. From 2019 to today, our apportionments have increased 59.6%. That is astronomical. I was talking with another bishop in another annual conference today and was giving these numbers to him, and he was aghast, saying, we don't have, our largest churches are having an increase of 2 and 3%. Last year, our apportionments increased 19.9%. That's in 1 year. 3 years, 51.8%. And we're going to come back and talk about apportionments and then total giving. Those are the things I'm going to try to help you understand over the next few weeks. All I want you to understand at this moment here is the increases are astronomical, unsustainable, and so much of there's two main reasons. We're successful. And a lot of that success goes to Edmond. They're a part of who we are. And we've had a growth rate that has just been astronomical. What was your statistic the other night at Ad Board?
For St. Luke's as a whole, since 2009, we've grown 194.6% in worship attendance.
That's amazing. So that growth, now they're going to wind up saying, you need to be paying so much more. However, when other churches are declining and you are growing, then it's a double hit. And so apportionments and the way that we distribute them, we believe needs to be addressed and changed because this is unsustainable.
I just want to say we have always lived out the commitment of John Wesley to serve the poor, to serve the community, to make a difference in the world. When we first established our church, it was called Tabernacle Church, and we first started on 3rd and Robinson, and as Bob said, one week we were United Methodists, I guess, but then we were the Methodist Episcopal South. When they first started in April of 1889, they quickly put up just a structure, and basically it was a covered, almost like a carport. On one side, there was a wall, and that's where the pulpit would stand. So there was a wall behind the pastor, but everything else was open. And they started calling it the tabernacle, the structure itself. They never voted on a name for the church entity until 1904 to call it St. Luke's. Tabernacle Methodist Church was kind of a happenstance. They built this structure, they called it the tabernacle after scripture, and it just kind of stuck until they actually decided on a name. And I love that because I think they were so busy building the church, doing evangelism and serving the poor that they didn't have time to take a church vote on a church name. That didn't happen for several years, but this is Tabernacle Methodist Church. And that was our first structure, and it was committed right from the beginning on things of serving the community, education, and healthcare. So the very first school in Oklahoma City was established in September of 1889 on the site right next to Tabernacle Methodist Church. They put up a tent there, and that was because they could use that land. It belonged to the church. And so the church committed this land so that they could start the very first school in Oklahoma City. And they liked it because there were no paved roads, obviously, and the streets were often muddy, and there were boards between the church and the school tent that the children didn't get too muddy going to school. So that was the first school in Oklahoma City. Forney Hutchinson, one of the early pastors of the church, was committed to evangelism and missions. And so the church exploded in growth and did incredible things serving the community. You had the development of the Methodist Women's Missionary Society. World Neighbors, as you know, was created when John Peters came to serve here for just a few months as an interim pastor. He preached this sermon that was so passionate about if you want to make a difference in this world, you've got to go out and serve those around you. And when everybody said amen and the service was over, nobody moved. And they said, okay, what do we do now? If you want to know the spirit of St. Luke's, it's that kind of moment. He had offered this challenge and wasn't prepared for them to take him up on it. But that's the heart of St. Luke's. And so World Neighbors was born out of that. Neighborhood Services Organization was started out of a group of women who the missions social service group out of the early days of St. Luke's got together, and they worked with some of the other women in the city, but they developed the Wesley Community House. was at Southwest 11th Street, and it was used as a church and a settlement house for those in need. It would become NSO. And the very first president of the Wesley Community House was Mrs. C.B. Hyde. And C.B. Hyde was one of the first chair people of our ad board. And so from our very beginning, we had a commitment to mission.
We want to just kind of see, really what started with John Wesley, that's who we are. And it's who we'll always be. With these kind of values, we've lived them through 133 years, all the different times of what we've had to face. And I'm very, very proud of who we are and our commitment, and that we've never lost that vision from that very first Sunday in 1889 and what started happening with our church. And it's who we are to this day. As I say, next week we're going to be spending some time looking at some growth statistics. You're going to start learning a little more of the interesting politics and intrigue and what the Methodist Church may hold in the future. Because my concern really isn't about what's happening at this moment so much, but what's the church going to look like in 2030? What's the church going to look like in 2040? That's what matters to me, that our church goes on and is in a position to make good decisions, to carry out this kind of ministry. And I want us to look at what we think are the trends and what we see is happening. So we're going to start diving into that next week, looking a little more at that, looking a little more at some of the offerings. So the two main themes that will pretty much go through our whole course are going to be money and sex, wouldn't you say?
I wasn't going to phrase it that way, I don't think.
When we just took our trip to Italy, you know, that's what you saw in all the kinds of places of what was winding up happening. And so we will talk about human sexuality, the fight in the Methodist Church, and we'll talk about this issue of money and what are we doing. But we wanted to stop at this time, and if you have a question that you've been writing down or occurred to you, we're going to have Susan running around picking them up. And while she's doing that, if you have that question, we're going to answer the two from last week.
So one was, when did the Methodist Church start ordaining women or have women preachers? And it's a couple different answers. The first ordination of women in our branch of the Methodist Church was in 1956, kind of sad. But women preachers really dates back all the way back to Susanna Wesley, who was a gifted speaker. She was dynamic. She would draw crowds. Her husband often was in debtor's prison, and the local vicar in his place didn't do very well, and so she would preach at her home and draw huge crowds. And so it really goes back to that. I wouldn't say that on his own, without his mom, John Wesley would have been a big proponent of women's rights, except that, again, he yielded to what he saw God doing. And so one of the other part of the question was, how did people react? I think that there's probably been a few at the forefront of women's rights throughout the Methodist tradition, and then I think there are some that are still wondering why they ordained us in the first place. But I can tell on my experience as a whole, I don't think I've experienced any more kind of issues for me being a woman pastor than I did as a female physical therapist or just being a woman in general. And I find that women today are quite able to rise above any kind of negative comments, and we don't need any kind of, we can handle it on our own. And so I think we're in a far better place. I'm so grateful for the women who had to go through so much pain and suffering, because I love what I do. And so I'm grateful for those who really paved the way.
And I've been doing this for, as I say, almost 50 years. I've had so many colleagues in ministry, and I can tell you I have never served with a person more effective, more committed, more knowledgeable, and more effective than Wendy Lambert.
I paid him to say that. So, thank you.
So I had the question that came in, and it said, how much money is it going to cost St. Luke's to buy their building, and how much money is it going to cost for us to leave the Methodist Church? That's a whole lot of question. First of all, we explained last week, and we'll be explaining again, we have our key leaders who have to make a recommendation to administrative board. Administrative board would have to approve. We begin disaffiliation discussions, and then we would have to have lots of discussions, and then a church-wide vote before a church ever leaves the United Methodist Church. None of that has happened. Okay, so we're already jumping all the way to that slot. None of that has happened. Secondly, the whole reason that everybody's talking about disaffiliation right now, as we mentioned last week, was paragraph 2553. 2553 lets you out of the trust clause. The trust clause says we don't own our building. Now, we may have raised all the money and spent it and built the building, but it is owned by the United Methodist Church. And so that's the trust clause. They hold it in trust. And General Conference in 2019 said, let's create a window that if people want to leave, they can leave, and there will be no trust clause, and they don't have to buy their building to go. That trust clause, that window ends in December of 2023. That's why you're seeing all this activity right now, and I think we have 29 churches lined up for this annual conference.
29 churches have already voted to disaffiliate in Oklahoma.
And so we have an annual conference in just a few weeks because the annual conference has to still vote to let somebody leave. So that's kind of the first wave. And that's what we're seeing in so many annual conferences right now. Well, some it's 100 and 200 and so on. So you don't have to buy your building if you leave under 2553. That ends in December of 23. When General Conference meets in 24, they may or may not establish another path for churches to exit if they want to exit. So that's the first thing. You've heard of so many denominations where churches were having to buy their buildings. The Methodist Church, in an attempt to be gracious, to say, if we have a difference in theology, we'll create a window where people don't have to do that. I thought that was very gracious of them at General Conference. The thing you do have to do is we have pensions in the Methodist Church, and because it is established, it's one of the largest pension programs in the United States. We have more than 100,000 people involved in it. We're over $20 billion in assets at this kind of time. But when we're at the moment, if we don't disaffiliate in terms of churches, if everything goes the way it goes, we have a plan that's fully funded. But as time goes on, you can have a downturn, kind of like we're in right now, and may get worse. And if that were to happen 20, 30 years from now, they could be underfunded. And so there's a pension liability, the possibility of a shortfall somewhere in the future, figured out by actuarials and people who look and act differently in some small room. And they figure all, if I have any actuarials here, no offense, it's just, I sit on the Board of Pensions for the United Methodist Church for the last 14 years, and wow, okay, they are amazing. So in order to cover that, every annual conference has a liability for the pension program. And so every church gets a piece of it, kind of the old apportionments, and so a church has to pay their piece of that pension liability, and it's supposed to be held in a fund in case it ever occurs. Okay, so that's a cost to leave. Then there's a retiree medical liability, much smaller. I'll talk about that on another different day. And then you're required to pay 2 years or 3 of apportionments. And so whatever the apportionment bill is, then you have to pay the year of it and the next year to basically try to say it's not going to be a hit all in 1 year. So really that's the cost of leaving, would be pension liability, retiree medical liability, and then your apportionments. So that's what these other churches are all committed to paying so that they are able to leave. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the future and help you understand that a little bit better. Okay, if a church's piece of the pie from the UMC is based on how much money is being spent by that church, what is the incentive to keep costs down at the church? That there you're, I don't know where that came from, but you're hitting exactly on the issue of if you have a church that is being innovative and creative and growing, then it feels like, to many people who've had those places, you're being penalized or you're not encouraged to grow. As an organization, I think the important thing would be, if you have places that are growing, when we're struggling so much, wouldn't it be smart to invest in those places and say, you seem to have it figured out. What can we do to be supportive of you so you can do more to win people to Christ, to share God's love and bring hope in the world? And the way that the program is working is that if you are doing better, then we want to take the money and we're going to turn around and give it to those who are struggling. And the results have been very small from that return. And we're going to talk about that as we go on as well. So I don't think we're using a good system if our goal is to win as many people to Christ as we can, to help as many people as we can in our community. Then I personally don't think we're doing it in a wise way. And so this really is one of the really de-incentivizers. Any more questions there? Yes? The question is a good question. Can St. Luke survive without the United Methodist Church?
Because there is a perception of what we would receive from the denomination.
Yeah, we receive zero. So if we were not a part of the United Methodist Church, it'd free up about $600,000. $600,000 to go do more mission. Programs for children, youth, whatever it is. So yes, we would survive. It actually would be a real boost of income. Mm-hmm. I'm going to let Wendy answer that one. The question is, what is the status and role of women agency do? And let me just tackle that if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Part of the goal was very much, Wendy was very gracious in how she was talking about it. Women, I had a mom that was a working mom back in the 50s. And I can tell you how unfair the workplace can be towards women. And so there was a real struggle. And there is still a real struggle for women in the workplace. There are many places to where we're setting that aside, but it is still very real. And so our status and role of women was supposed to be looking at the church, the Methodist Church, and saying, are we doing our part to make sure that women are treated equal as men, and we're helping them to be able to live out their calling without being second-class citizens? And it was not just for the church, but also what are we doing for society to stand up for the role of women and how they are. So there was a real issue on doing that. There also have always at times when you do something good, and that's good, and that was so important. We move on to other organizations we have, sometimes in the church, and they come to meetings and they'll write down every time who speaks, and is it a man or is it a woman, is it white, is it black, and so we're not being fair in how this gets distributed. That's when you say, really?
I would find that, I understand the thought process behind that, but to me, I would find that insulting because either I have something to say or I don't. I love being a woman, but I'm a pastor because I want to tell people about God. And so if I were getting, kind of a check mark just for the sake of that I'm a woman, that would bother me. I can tell you one story that kind of comes out of this: well-intended people and the consequences that could come out of it. And it's just kind of funny. This is several years ago. You don't know anybody involved. And anybody online, you don't know anybody involved. But from annual conference level, they were trying to address the problems that women pastors have to face out in the world. And so I was told that I had to be part of a mandatory women's peer group and drive and be a part of this group on a weekly basis, spend an hour or two supporting other women pastors. Now, they weren't making men do this, and I had so many other things to do with my time, but they were going to help us women by forcing us together and the time, and so those kind of things. It was they really wanted to help. They didn't ask me if that would be helpful to me, but those kind of things.
And I am sorry, I didn't see it on the on this sheet. I just
always ignoring the women issues.
I was just opening the sheet up, thought, what is this folded up here? And I said, we do take all questions, and I'm happy to answer all of them. One of the questions was just the fact that, Wendy, you are far better dresser than I am. There's no question about it, and I'm working on trying to always raise myself up. But as you can imagine, what the question actually was, Wendy is certainly known for her stylish shoes. And there was an affirmation of you and your stylish shoes. And so...
when you have a big black robe, all you have are your shoes on a Sunday morning. So. I haven't been allowed to expense them yet, but...
Okay, we're 6 minutes over. We're trying to always hold our things to an hour, and I just want to say thank you so much for being here. We really do want your questions because we want to keep taking it. You've asked really good questions, and next week we're going to dive into a little more fun kind of politicking and understanding what's going on.
More fun than this?
So we will have a good time next week as we are doing it. Thank you so much. I hope you have a blessed week. Have a good night.